Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture, and I'm Stephen Coates, taking another trip down the byways and forgotten roads of the counterculture in Britain and beyond. Now, if I said to you the name Barney Bubbles, you'd be forgiven for thinking perhaps that we were going to hear about a circus performer, or the sort of person who appears at children's parties. But the Barney Bubbles that we're going to talk about today is another one of those lost or forgotten heroes of the British counterculture that we love so much. He was the designer of many album covers, some of which I'm sure you're familiar with if you're an album cover lover. In that world, of course, he is famous in the world of graphic design and in the world of independent press from the 70s. And he's one of those few people, perhaps like the band Hawkwind who we heard about previously, who successfully bridged the late 60s, early 70s hippie counterculture into the punk and post-punk era beyond. His life is extraordinary and tragic somewhat, and his mind was certainly magic. And we're going to hear about him from somebody who probably knows his story best. The man who's written the biography of Bubbles and curated several exhibitions about him. He's a countercultural hero in himself, though not forgotten quite yet. So it's a great pleasure and privilege to have with us the writer, the curator, the commentator on all things counterculture, Mr. Paul Gorman. Hello, Paul.
Hi there, how are you?
Very good. Welcome, Paul, to the Bureau of Lost Culture. Listen, I'm not going to butcher your bio. It's way too extensive and complicated for that. So why don't you tell us, who is Mr. Paul Gorman?
I mean, basically, I'm a writer. You know, that's what I've been earning my crust from the written word for, it shocks me to say, 42 years. You know, I started at 18 on a trade paper as a trainee journalist, you know, going once a week to this building which housed the Times, where we'd have seminars on shorthand and the legal aspects of journalism, or learning how to cast off, which is counting the number of words that appear in a column, and, you know, all about typography. Well, the kind of nuts and bolts of typography and the printing process.
I guess a lot of those processes are now extinct, but I'm also guessing that that's where you really developed your love of print, paper print and stuff, right? I
guess so, yeah. I come from a literary family in that we're extremely interested in text. I'm the youngest of six. None of us went into further education, though three of my brothers, I had three brothers, were all librarians. My oldest brother became quite a notable bibliographer and was president of he's lived in America for a long time, he was president of the American Library Association. So there's something about words that I think I've inherited or am part of, or printed words. And so, you know, it was in the blood, as it were, and I just really followed that path of learning the kind of professional side of it, all the while accumulating knowledge about the kind of less professional side, whether it was fanzines or, you know, I first started buying, you know, not kiddie comics or whatever, but at the fag end of the underground press in 1972, you know, I got a copy of Frendz magazine, and a friend down the road gave me some copies of Oz. And so I was kind of inculcated in that alternative means of expression, which after all was really rooted in those technological processes, you know, IBM golf ball typewriters, offset litho.
Paste up.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. But really cheap and cheerful and effective and impactful ways of communicating words in print.
So how did you go from that, you know, cutting your teeth in that hard-boiled commercial world to being, you know, an independent writer and cultural curator, etc.?
Throughout that period, me and my first wife, we kind of lived an alternative existence as well. She was in print production, actually, amazing print production person, manager. But, you know, we go to clubs, we'd hang out in shops in the King's Road and Covent Garden and Soho. We had lots of friends who were doing, you know, interesting things. You know, everyone was trying to scuffling away. The 80s weren't as glamorous as they'd been painted out. You know, this was a kind of a tough time. So I was blessed, really, that I had a job throughout that period. but it also funded me in, you know, as I say, accumulating this knowledge about the other side of stuff that I was interested in. I was particularly interested in the visual, you can be posh about it and call it the visual identity of music, but really it was about fashion and street style and the way that that popped when it was, when it coincided with really fantastic music. Whether that's, you know, Peter Tosh and U Roy or Elvis Costello and the Attractions, or even Can or something like that. You know, they had, all of these people had really a grasp of visual identity, you know, craft work or whatever, to go with this explosive music that they were making. And simultaneously, I was, you know, really diving into the whole lifestyle press of the period, starting with The Face, and then going out from there. I'd already, as a teen, become interested in magazines like Andy Warhol's Interview and Ritz, which was the kind of UK counterpart at the fanzines, as I've mentioned. And so this all kind of snowballed in my head as I was, you know, working this 9-to-5 job. And then it kind of coincided really for the first time professionally when I got a job as the West Coast bureau chief, I was called, basically the LA editor for a film trade magazine, Screen International. And so we moved to LA, and I worked there for a while, and that kind of changed me, I think. That experience. I had some family there and some friends and had a great time, but it kind of opened me up. This is the early 90s. Music was changing. This is post-acid house. It was, it became, you know, something that I thought, well, there's no going back now. I'm writing about film. It's film industry. I'm always interested in the people behind the scenes. So it really turned me on to interview Don Simpson rather than, I did interview film stars, but a bit like musicians, they're kind of difficult to interview because they're selling something. Whereas if you talk to somebody who's making the films, they're kind of often much more interesting and mad and maniacal, and they've got a really interesting worldview. And so having done that and written about film, I came back to London and started freelancing.
Right, so I'm just going back to the subject of magazines and stuff. I mean, I got interested myself in that whole amazing world of independent press, partly from that exhibition that you curated at Somerset House a few years back, Print, Tear It Up. I know there's a lot of stuff in there from your archive. Wonderful graphics, wonderful sort of paper ephemera and objects. That was a lot of your stuff, right?
We got some fantastic loans as well. The second issue of Blast, the second and last issue of Blast, the kind of Autism magazine from 1914, 1915. So there were some key loans in there as well, but a lot of it came from my archive.
Yeah, I mean, it really evoked the spirit of the counterculture, I thought. I mean, interesting that you say, you know, that goes all the way back to the vortices, if not further. But Paul, tell us, what do you understand by the word counterculture, or the phenomena counterculture?
It's difficult. Well, is it difficult? I don't know. I think it's sort of anti-de rigueur thinking. I think it's an alternative way of looking at the world, and using quite often alternative means of expression to communicate your message. And so in my world, in a way, my books have, and this is all praxis, I've only found this out after 20 years of publishing books, you kind of look back and go, oh, really, that's what it's about. In my world, somebody like Barney Bubbles, who I think we're going to talk about in a while, the graphic designer, was far more important than the story of pop in the 70s and 80s, from the late 60s to the early 80s. He was the key figure. Or somebody like Malcolm McLaren, who I've written about. He was the key figure in punk for me. Beyond, you know, I saw lots of punk bands, and most of them, I saw the Lurkers, you know, and lived. I saw lots of that. That music was not good, and the presentation was no good either. I mean, obviously there were some great bands in there, but it was people like him. So I had this kind of alternative history of popular culture, which was running around in my head. The thing about the clothes, you know, I knew Bernard Lansky made the clothes for Elvis, and Elvis wearing those clothes, which was basically African American high fashion, as it was called, you know, pimp style, really, of the 50s. A skinny white kid with a great voice and charisma wearing those clothes made something else happen. So I knew all of that stuff. John Stephen, in, you know, the great gay pioneer who basically created Carnaby Street. I was more interested in him than, say, the Kinks.
Yeah, absolutely. When we talk about counterculture, you know, my take on it is that whenever there's a culture, there's a counterculture. There's something, you know, contrary to it. But for you, that's interesting because it's not just about music or the 1950s, 60s and 70s or even the 80s. It's a wider thing. It's about fashion, it's about style, it's about the city, it's about community, it's about press and media. Music was just part of it.
I think music was an element rather than the overriding thing, which is why the music press, I'm just rewriting my music press book now, so I'm thinking about this a lot. I think that's why it started to falter seriously in the 80s, because it had misunderstood for a very long time that music was the be all and end all.
Yeah, and of course that's been even more exaggerated in recent years with streaming, which has kind of had the effect of separating the music even further from all those other things. But let's circle around towards Bubbles, Paul. I mean, it seems to me that you've been championing him for years, really. Is it 3 exhibitions and the book now?
I'm working on a 3rd edition now, yeah.
Great stuff. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, it's his 80th anniversary coming up. But despite that, I mean, he does remain in the shadows, you know, outside the worlds of, you know, graphic design and album art aficionados. He's one of those people that really is, you know, most people don't know about, which, given the sort of breadth and scope of his work and, you know, the very interesting life that he led and, you know, his tragic end and stuff, it's a shame and it's a bit of a mystery, really. So for anybody listening who doesn't know who Barney Bubbles was and his work and stuff, Paul, why don't you give us his bio? Tell us all about him. Who was he and where did he come from?
He was born Colin Fulcher in Witton in Middlesex, just quite close to Heathrow, out of West London suburb. And he was a brilliant kid. It appeared to come from nowhere, but and if you look into his family background, his father was a precision engineer. And I think that takes a lot of skill, that business. And so I think, you know, he was quite a brilliant kid and was also part of that art school explosion of the late 50s and early 60s, which basically contributed to the counterculture we're talking about. And then, of course, mass culture. And so he went to Twickenham Art School when he was 16 in 1958. And he was there for 5 years. He majored in paper and card for retail display, which is quite interesting when you think about his elaborate album sleeve designs, which he produced later on. And he was a brilliant student. At the same time, he was heavily involved in music. Eel Pie, the Eel Pie Hotel on Eel Pie Island was pretty close. Twickenham Art School used to have their Christmas dances there, and so he made posters. One of his earliest posters for music was for the Rolling Stones, a performance there just before they went stratospheric in 1963. When he left, he started working for an extremely hard-edged continental-style typographer called Michael Tucker, where he learned all about typography. All the stuff that he hadn't learned in the multidisciplinary 5 years at Twickenham Art School were then applied, all that stuff he had learned, were applied to this commercial business of producing everything from liveries to posters for films to, you know, any kind of commission could come in. And one of the people he worked with told me that it was very, it's kind of very hip. And so everyone had to wear nice Ivy League button-down shirts. You know, it was a kind of unspoken rule that you would adopt this look and this style. And was always not an ampersand, but a cross. So I think he was Michael Tucker, Cross, and Associates. So he had a couple of years there. And then in 1965, when Terence Conran launched a design studio to service. He'd already opened the Habitat and he'd had a restaurant before then. But this is really the idea of good taste in furnishings and home decorations and homewares.
And kind of whole lifestyle approach to sort of design things, sort of bringing design into the kind of the average house sort of thing.
Exactly. You know, this was after, you know, post-war austerity period where everyone lived with their grandparents' furniture or austerity furniture. Well, most people did. But he was introducing, Conran was championing clean lines, European, you know, design aesthetics. And so Bubbles, still then Colin Fulcher, became senior graphic designer and oversaw a bunch of campaigns, whether it's for seed packets. There was a restaurateur and grocer, really, called Justin DeBlanc, who I also interviewed for the book, sadly no longer with us, who was very, very straight-edged. I mean, I think the young royals were clients of his shop in Knightsbridge, but Colin Fulcher was designing this really great kind of slightly back to the land, crafty logos and everything for the packaging, for the letterheads, for the in-store displays. And so he was really at the top of his game. And later on, he was interviewed only twice, one very short interview in Smash Hits, of all places, but the only other interview, because he was quite shy and retiring and very hardworking, he gave for the Face. He was pointing out that to be a commercial artist in the mid to late 60s, or probably the mid 60s, was really a hit job. You know, it was a kind of a new thing. Advertising was just coming in. So young advertising guys were suddenly very glamorous, weren't they? You know, It wasn't just the photographers that we know about. It was all of those service industries around them. So he had this very hit job and then went to California in 1968 and basically tuned in, turned on and dropped out.
Yeah, and I mean, to look back a little bit, you know, you were saying yourself earlier about how important it was for you to kind of cut your teeth in the hard-boiled commercial world, which he did too. And I'm guessing that, you know, he learnt the techniques, which were going to become very important later. He learnt his work ethic and, you know, very hard working. I don't know what the British advertising industry was like, but if it was anything like Mad Men, you know, you get this impression it was like very hard working, hard partying, probably quite well paid, quite glamorous, quite tough environment. And he's got all that as the kind of context, the sort of bedrock for what happens next. And then goes to California, gets immersed in that West Coast counterculture, add a drop of acid and boom.
As I understand it, rather a lot of acid. He was developing, he lived in the flat in West Kensington, and he was developing this alter ego while he was still at Conran Design. And so with another art student friend and a few of them, he set up this thing called A1 Good Guys, GUYZ. I think everyone was looking to America, and, you know, this is very much post-Royal College celebration of, you know, American street culture, neon signs, and this kind of quasi-glitzy, quite kitschy way of looking at the world. And so they used to have happenings. They made films, Alice in Wonderland, for example. They all dressed up in Mad Hatter or whatever and filmed themselves and had screenings. And so it wasn't such a shift by the time he got to California and the West Coast and LA and San Francisco, because he'd been setting the scene for it. He went to the 14-hour Technicolor Dream, for example. Right. I mean, he'd fully indulged in a lot of those early, almost pre-psychedelic experiences. Because Conran Design was off Tottenham Court Road, he and a friend were working late one night and they walked past the Blarney Club and went to UFO and saw Pink Floyd and went back. He started making the oil light shows for bands. And there was, you know, this bubble effect that we all know now, is very familiar. And so adopted this alter ego, Barney Bubbles, for that work, which was outside of the Colin Fulcher straight work.
So that was, you know, partly his American experiences and then seeing Pink Floyd at UFO. That was some sort of epiphany, was it?
I think it was a gradual thing that was always within him. If you look at his art school books, and there's always this other side to him, which is mischievous, playful, experimental, thoughtful, all of these things. And so he's been to UFO, been to the 14-hour Technicolor Dream. In 1968, he gives up his job and goes to Los Angeles and then California, then San Francisco, operated a light show at the Avalon Ballroom. He writes on a card back to one of his girlfriends at the time, and really returned a different person. Some of this is, of course, due to the acid consumption, because it was, and this was Owsley acid as well. He had, it should be pointed out, it's clear that he suffered from incipient bipolarity, undiagnosed for a very, very long time. I don't think the acid helped in that regard in terms of his mental health, because I think he was quite fragile for the whole of his life. But what it did do was have this amazing effect on his work. You see a shift change, gear shift change in his work. Suddenly it becomes, and it's not in the sort of Beatles, oh, hey man, it's got this hard edge to it, but it's incredibly colorful. It's really audacious use of graphics, photography, typography, all of those things in his arsenal. And so he returns to London and inspired by the communes that he'd seen on Haight-Ashbury and other places, he opened what he wanted to be was a safe haven for artists, designers, musicians in this 3-story building in Portobello Road at number 307. And he called that Teen Burger.
Right, so it was much more than the acid, wasn't it? I mean, he was being in America, being in California, being in San Francisco, witnessing all that stuff going off, you know, the wave of the American counterculture going west. Haight-Ashbury, you know, communal living alternatives being explored, psychedelic graphics, lights, music, the whole thing. And then, of course, bringing that, coming back to London and having absorbed and immersed himself in all that stuff. And then London itself was kicking off somewhat, wasn't it, right?
Well, I think it was kicking off, but only in little, you know,
pockets,
little sects and SECTS and pockets, as you say. I think London was still pretty black and white. And Portobello Road was this very fertile area. You know, it obviously been connected to Rackman and Christine Keeler, and it was the place where you could score great weed and, you know, listen to great Afro-Caribbean music, which was melding with these new young bands who were emerging from there. And so 307 Portobello Road, he allowed bands like Quintessence and Brinsley Schwartz to rehearse in the basement. He had the ground floor as a design studio. Jonathan Green, who wrote the great Days in the Life and All Dressed Up, and knew Bubbles quite well, said he was kind of a service industry to them.
Amazing.
I mean, I remember one of my brothers, you know, he was an out and out hippie at the Roundhouse all the time. He had a friend called Mouse. Mouse had a van. So if you needed anything moving, Mouse would do it. He was a long-haired, barefoot hippie. Bubbles, in the same way, was this incredible bloke that you could go to get your visuals done. And so that's really when he enters music with Teen Burger designs, and he designed 4 or 5 or 6, I think, album covers, which starts him off on this road to, for me, really realizing a visual identity for music that without it, you can't listen to the music in the same way. You can't imagine one without the other.
For some of the bands from that time, you can't really separate, or I can't separate the actual music from that visual thing about the album cover art. And he was really instrumental in that, wasn't he? You've got, you know, the band records some stuff, some songs, but then you're working with a person like Bubbles who extracts something, some essence or some vibe from the music, from the songs, and makes the album cover. And the album itself then becomes this artifact which is bigger than the music and lives on in the memory, or, you know, as a thing in itself, which is not just the music, but it's about his artwork, right? And that was a big difference, a big move forward.
Yeah, on the most straightforward level, you could see that what's happening when he's at Comrade Design in the mid-60s and a seed manufacturer comes along and says, can you make us some seed packets? He's doing the same thing. He's communicating the consumer, the music fan. He's communicating with them in the best way possible to present the music. But there is something else about him which is quite difficult to pin down. And I think it's down to those 10 years, 5 years at art school, 5 years in commercial design. It's down to that he engages, he understands the tricks by which you engage people who are looking at visual stuff. And he'll use anything, but he's not scared to be cheesy. You know, the first album he designed, Quintessence, he didn't actually do the cover, which is a kind of tawdry portrait of an Indian god, I think. But inside there's a booklet, and it's got apertures cut into the paper, and so that when it's at one side, it's a pyramid made out of dots, and then you flick it through. So it's like a flick book. He wasn't afraid to use that stuff, but there are these fantastic use of these black and white portraits of the Quintessence members with sitars or whatever against that. So he's quite tricksy, but not cheesy.
And at the same time as all that's going on, he was really living it, as many people were. That, you know, he's created this refuge on Portobello Road, which is now some of the most expensive real estate in London, and welcoming people for all sorts of creative endeavours. He sounds like he was quite a noble soul, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think he was, you know, a proper hippie in that regard. It was about community. And so there were draft dodgers living there. There was John Cowell, who was known as Record John, who's actually Simon Cowell's half-brother, who was fantastic. He had a fantastic record shop. So you wanted anything, because these are the days when, you know, you could only get Grateful Dead albums on import or whatever. You know, the world wasn't sewn up like it is today. But so Record John was there kind of providing the vibes. You had the bands in the basement, him working away. And in 1970, so a year after he occupied 307, next door Frendz magazine, the underground magazine, Frendz, which had come out of this attempt at a UK Rolling Stone called Friends of Rolling Stone, with that failed. And so this underground magazine, Frendz, set up. And of course, naturally, they went to him to be the art director.
Right, and, you know, Frendz, legendary underground magazine, you know, his designs would have influenced a lot of people then, and they carried on doing so, didn't they? Even if he's rather forgotten by the public.
Oh, yeah. No, I think so. There's, it was no problem to, you know, get Peter Saville to talk about him for an introduction for my book. Malcolm Garrett, the designer who worked with him, actually, is another fan. But Neville Brody, the art director of The Face in the 80s, is an obvious example. The way in which he applied sort of post-constructivist typography in new and revealing ways. That really goes back to what Barney Bubbles had done 5 or 6 years earlier. And now there's a new generation. Well, Kate Morose is a really great designer, and they say a lot of good things about Barney Bubbles. Architect Adam Nathaniel Furman, didn't really know about him until my wife showed him. And he works in a very postmodern way, the similar way with objects and buildings that Bubbles did with his work.
Yeah, so looping back again, you know, he was the art director at Frendz, and then he develops this really important relationship with the band Hawkwind. We did an interview with George Banks about his new book about Hawkwind and that whole West London scene. And, you know, Hawkwind were the archetypal, the essentials West London countercultural band at the time. It's quite a different vibe than Chelsea and in Soho, more radical, more political. And Bubbles and Hawkwind get into this very fertile creative relationship. But just tell us how that came about.
I think literally they were kind of the house band of Frendz. They were in Frendz all the time. And so Nick Turner, the saxophonist, was hanging out at Frendz, and they were introduced and became firm friends. He then pretty soon starts designing record sleeves for them. They had a surprise hit in 1972, the summer of 1972, with Silver Machine, which earned them a lot of money. This was a band that was a really mixed media event rather than a straightforward group. So they would set up a rhythm. It's kind of akin to krautrock. And they used various sort of psychedelic devices, which they'd made themselves. They had a shifting cast of people. In their prime, they had the dancer Miss Stacia, who was painted by Bubbles. You know, he would design the positions where they stood on stage according to their astrological chart. He decorated their equipment.
Those were the days, right?
Those were the days. You don't get that with Take That. But he also really communed with one of their contributors, well, a couple of their contributors, the poet and writer Robert Calvert, who actually similarly suffered from bipolarity, and the writer and author Michael Moorcock. And so I started to go and see Hawkwind. I was about 13, so 1973, and you'd see Stacia dancing, Nick Turner dressed as a frog playing the saxophone, this fantastic day glow equipment behind them, a light show, the pulsating rhythms, 20-minute versions of songs. It's like trance, really. It's like trance, 20 years before trance. Michael Moorcock intoning his poetry, Robert Calvert dressed in leather chaps shouting through it. It was a really great thing. It was an amazing, for a young person. It was just.
I mean, in some ways, there's a sort of parallel between what Bubbles does next and with Hawkwind, because they, when they were never in fashion, but they were never out of fashion, and still aren't. And they're completely independent all the way through that, and still are, right?
They've done their thing, and it's kind of all encompassing. It's really charming. It's really independent. It's really do it yourself. That's why lots of people who were punks love them. John Lydon would go and see them. Jar Wobble, who's a pal, we were talking about going to see them at the Roundhouse quite a lot. They were also ever present. They played a lot. They played benefits, played charity gigs. They were all around. You couldn't miss them. And at the same time, there were other groups who played with them a lot. People I liked, like the Pink Fairies, who were quite rock and quite MC5-ish and leather jacketed, and they had a bit of edge. At that point, I don't really believe music had taken a dive. I don't believe that version of events. I think there was a lot of great music around. Whether it's Kevin Coyne or Kevin Ayers or Robert Wyatt or any of those people, I love them all and I still love them. But Hawkwind was somewhere in that mix.
I mean, another thing about them that's interesting to me is that they were sort of in reaction to the kind of bourgeois complexities and pomposity of the sort of prog bands of the era. Where the audience was supposed to sort of, admire the musicians from a distance. They were kind of street and quite punk themselves, of course, right? And why use 3 or 2 chords when one'll do?
And a ring oscillator, a light show, and you're off.
And with this sort of visual identity designed by Bubbles, and these album covers, they are progressive actually and cosmic, but they've got this kind of wonderful geometric sort of quality to them, this sort of Chinese puzzle intersecting planes and stuff, and a bit mathematical, and of course his background in that 60s stuff, making things for shop advertising and seed packets and stuff. They've got these wonderful sort of die cuts and folds, and that becomes part of Hawkwind's visual identity. So it's almost like he's a sort of visual member of the band in some way.
Yes, exactly. And he had his place there, because you must point out there was a character, Jonathan Liquid Len and the Lensman. That team put together the light shows, which allowed Bubbles to concentrate on basically a total look at a group. And in marketing terms, it was brilliant. So they were, I don't think the Stones were even doing, John Pash tongue T-shirts at that point, or badges. I really don't think so. But with Hawkwind, you could buy the T-shirt, the badge. It was a total identity. He changed their logo several times, quite Teutonic at times. quite sort of Asgardian, mythic, whatever you want to call it, at other times. But he was somebody in control. They said to him, look, do what thou will to with our visual identity. And so that was an extraordinary thing, and it's a thing that lots of bands didn't pick up on for quite a while.
Now, you said earlier that he was quite fragile with his mental health, even though he's sort of at the heart of that scene. Do you know much about his personal life? What was going on for him internally, as it were?
Well, he had a partner, Gianna. They had a son, Arton, in 1973. He bought a place in Ireland. I think he was going through some episodes. By the early to mid 70s, Hawkwind were coming out of that first kind of imperial pomp of that period. Everything, the culture was changing. The mid 70s. Actually, having said that, economically it was quite tough, and I think people with long hair who'd invested a lot in the 60s dream were really feeling it. So he bought a place in Ireland, and they moved there, but he couldn't stay there, and he left them there. And Gianna had another partner and went on her way with Arton's stepfather. And he returned to London and kind of went into hiding back at the house where he'd been born in Witten. Did some work for some people. Let It Rock magazine he redesigned. He was working away quietly, and he'd always been this retiring person. We ought to point out, he adopted this pseudonym. More often than not, he didn't sign his artworks. He had money troubles because record companies are pretty ramshackle and take a long time to pay, and even when they pay, it's not very much. So I think he was in some difficulties, but he had worked with this pub rock band called Chilly Willy and the Red Hot Peppers, who were managed by a wonderful character, Andrew Jakeman, otherwise Jake Riviera. And Jake had really been inspired by Barney Bubbles. They worked together on these silly sleeves and great artworks, roundels for the stage. This was a way out of the quite heavy atmosphere of Hawkwind into something much more light and cheery. And so when Chilly Willy and the Red Hot Peppers split up, Jake Riviera joined his friends Dr. Feelgood on a tour of America. In New Orleans, he was looking through all these little record labels, these little independent record labels, and thought, fuck it, I'm going to go back and launch my own record label, which he did, Stiff Records, with a friend of his from the pub rock scene, Dave Robinson. And it took him a while. I think it took him 6 months. So it launched in August 1976. So punk is really beginning to start. First single was really, a hard-edged song, which really chimed with the times. I remember I was given it by a stallholder in Soho. Like, fucking hell, this is really it. Which was Nick Lowe's Heart of the City. They had a designer, Kevin Sparrow, who'd also worked in the underground press, and he had a kind of cheery, beery look to it, kind of these fat letterings for the Stiff Records logo. Released the Damn single, was the first punk single, New Rose. And then eventually Jake managed to track Barney Bubbles down and said, you've got to come here and be our art director, because he knew how brilliant he could be at conveying the visual identity of the music. And so by the beginning of 1977, I've got a letter Bubbles sent to one of his friends talking about how excited he is to be back in the swim of things. He's cut his hair. He's involved in concrete poetry performances, and there's a play that's supposed to happen. I don't know whether it ever happened, but in the Stiff offices, he'd found a community again. There were these wonderful people who worked there, some of whom are friends now, Suzanne Spiro and Cynthia Lowell, and Jake being ever dynamic. So he really found his feet again, and I think it really helped him out of that depression that he'd sunk in.
Right, and you can't overstate this shift, from doing that kind of psychedelic, hippie, spacey design for Hawkwind and others, and moving into that post-punk and post-punk world of the mid 70s, for Stiff Records, and it, complete change of style in some way, but still extraordinarily impactful, and he sort of shaped the aesthetic of that era, you know, in the way that Jamie Reed did, right? And I'm assuming he cut his hair and started dressing differently. But I suppose in parallel to Hawkwind, you know, as we were saying, is that they kind of made the shift. They stayed popular, but also they were loved by some punks like, as you said, Lydon and Jar Wobble and stuff. And so he bridges the gap, doesn't he? And you know, his stuff for Stiff, it's like he has a second life, and it's very strong, unusual stuff.
It's kind of Warholian as well. The use of silk screens. There are a series of posters for the 5 characters who were on the first Stiffs tour, and he made them 60 inches by 40 inches, so quite big, and they were made to be sold at the gigs on this tour. And each of them is screened. Nick Lowe, Larry Wallace, Ian Dury, Elvis Costello, Reckless Eric. Each of them is screened in this really Warholian way, which makes them look really heroic. You know, in fact, they're scuffling ex-pub rockers for the most part. But there's, you know, he understands how to, but there was something heroic about them at the same time. And so he understands how to convey that, just as he did with Hawkwind, in a way. I mean, Malcolm McLaren was interviewed backstage at a fashion show in 1982, so 5 years after 1977, the height of punk, by a Japanese TV crew. And they asked him, what is punk? And so he said, what I'm doing now with his partner Vivienne Westwood, which was designing these amazing clothes as streetwear, was that he said, what I'm doing now is the same as I was doing then, because punk is an attitude, and it's predicated on DIY, doing it for yourself, independence, and with that, anti-corporatism. And so Stiff Records expressed that, and so did Barney Bubbles throughout his life. He very rarely works for the major labels. Quite often he's gravitating to the independents and the outsiders. McLaren also said, for me, it has to have an aspect of chaos to it to make it really work. And I think that's the same with Bubbles, actually. I think his work is so precise, but I think his mind was incredibly chaotic. And there's something about that energy which comes across in his work.
Yeah, you also mentioned, you know, apart from being shy and retiring, he's also very modest. I mean, he didn't insist on his name being on the album covers as designer even. I mean, these days, that seems extraordinary. I mean, people sort of sneeze in the studio, they want to credit. And
exactly, you know, it's all selfies, isn't it? But he, in that Face interview that he gave, he said, well, the bloke who designs the baked bean tin doesn't sign that. So it goes back to that thing. He wouldn't sign the seed packets, you know, when he was at Comrade Design. So that was one justification. The other was that he dodged the tax man for a very, very long time, which was to lead to trouble eventually, which, you know, I think actually could have been solved. But I think his state of mind he painted himself into a bit of a corner there. I mean, he was also working with these really supreme artists of the period. So whether it's Ian Dury in his absolute pomp, or Elvis Costello, you know, he designed the first 6 albums and most of the single sleeves. But one of those, Get Happy, which is a really great kind of soul, neo-soul and R&B record, he signed it with his VAT number. But he's asking for trouble there, really.
Yeah, so he's right at the centre of things. He's producing this extraordinary artwork for this new generation of artists who are, you know, cutting edge or right at the centre of things here. Then what happens next?
Well, he follows Jake Riviera. It couldn't really last with Dave Robinson, two such explosive figures. So Jake Riviera went off and joined a label called Radar, a new label that was being set up. And so Bubbles followed him and became art director of that. And that's really where he got into his stride with people like Nick Lowe and Elvis Costello. And thereafter, Riviera set up his own label, F-Beat, which had a deal with one of the majors. And so Bubbles was chafing at the grind of producing record sleeves. And Peter Saville talks about it, and anybody who's ever done it will talk about it. It's like, you know, you have to design, at that point, there were 4 inkies, music papers. You designed the ads as well for those. It was quite a tough brief. you know, to come up with single sleeves, album sleeves, posters, ads. Bubbles was doing all of that, working. Some people just don't know how he did it. He was such a forward adopter that in 1978, he moved into a warehouse in Shoreditch, just around the corner from Old Street. And it was a live workspace, but there was a bed and a sofa and a TV. But he was just working all the time. I've seen pictures of it, and Brian Griffin, the great photographer, he was a great collaborator. He worked with really great people as well. So Brian Griffin was he's a really superb photographer, and worked with him. But Brian told me that there was a sort of central column which held up the roof, I imagine. And there was a list on there of jobs. And, you know, he'd go over and tick one off. Ian Jury would come by. Bubbles had this idea for 24 album sleeves of different wallpaper samples because they were 12 inches. And so Martin, Smart Mark Cole, who was Ian Jury's wingman, said that they went round there and laid them all out. They had 48 they were going to pick from. And this is sort of midnight. We're working away going, well, we'll do this for Israel and these 5 for the US. Right. So he's working very hard. He's in a relationship with Belinda Syme, another artist, an Australian artist. And he starts designing furniture initially for Jake's office at FB's. So, but it's typical of him. The desk is in the shape of a trowel, held up by a column of books, made in beautiful bird's eye maple by this great furniture maker. A cocktail cabinet made in 50s Formica, rugs, clocks. You know, he's really chafing at the album sleeve thing because he's finding it too restrictive.
Where's all that stuff now?
I've got a couple of the pieces. And he only made about 6 or 7 furniture pieces, and they're still with those people. He also painted for about a year these kind of abstracts, but very graphic. Less successful, I think, than his graphics, but he wanted to kind of step out from this role. But we're in the early 80s now, and things have changed. You know, the punk has been subsumed into new wave, which is really quite commercial, and post-punk. That's when you see people like Savile emerging, really. Not to replace him, but he really admired Savile. He liked his work, you know, and Savile will tell you that he took a lot from using the odd juxtapositions that Bubbles had, you know, when he's representing the visual identity of Joy Division and then New Order.
Yeah. Well, Paul, we're moving towards the end of this programme and also the end of Bubbles' life, and it's tragic what happens. Why don't you tell us about it and how it came about?
Well, he had these severe money worries. There are tales of, because he didn't sign his work, there are tales of younger designers taking his work around to record companies saying, I designed this and aren't I brilliant, and getting gigs from that. He sunk into a depression, which he found very difficult to get out of. He started having episodes. And as I say, this is 1983, so long before, you know, anything is really understood outside of clinical circles about bipolarity. And so he took his life. He took his own life in November 1983, cornered by, I think, his mental illness, which were expressed in those kind of, you know, the worries of finances and taxes. He spoke to a couple of people before he did it. And then that was it. And, you know, all of those people around him were incredibly shocked because he would not express this darker side. But if you look at, as I've had to do really in terms of setting out his work, if you look at the last year of his work, it becomes incredibly reductive and there are dark signs there. He was one of his woes that his first album sleeve for Elvis Costello was rejected. And it's for Punch the Clock, which came out in 1984, I think. But it's an amazing image, but quite frightening image of an electrified Elvis. Costello says, you know, God, if I'd have known, it's a really great, anybody else, you know, that would be fine. But it was just, but it was quite a frightening image. For, I think Punch the Clock is quite a commercial album. It was produced by Langer and Winstanley, so who were big with Dexys Midnight Runners and all that stuff. So I think Costello was trying to place himself at the commercial cutting edge and sell a few records, you know, after all. So the signs were there, but as so often with these people, you know, those closest to you don't really see what's about to happen. Interestingly, in terms of the history of design, 6 weeks later, the first Apple Mac is introduced. So all of his work had been hand rendered. He'd never worked with computers. By the way, he directed 10 or 15 videos, including the Ghost Town for the specials we should talk about. So suddenly, the end of 83, when he dies, beginning of 84, is the beginning of the digital age. And CDs are taking off. You know, the framework has been shrunk from 12 inches, or if he wants to fold it out to 36 inches, down to, what is it, 6 inches CD? You know, pretty unsatisfactory, you know, way of conveying the musical identity. So it's interesting. His timing was fantastic.
Sort of very sad timing, wasn't it? But we're not even a chance to get into the videos and stuff. But you know, he did all sorts of stuff, didn't he? I mean, you posted something fairly recently about that amazing tarot deck he did for Hawkwind in IT.
Quite often he would use that. We talked about earlier about his ways of engaging people. So he designed a hawk in the shape of a set of tarot cards, to which he gave properties, which appeared on a double-page spread in IT, the underground newspaper. At the same time, you know, a few years later, he designed a program for Ian Jury and the Blockheads, which had cut out symbols, and you could turn it into a hat you could wear. There's, for Chili Willy and the Red Hot Peppers, there's a colour in and cut out bow tie insert. So, you know, he was constantly looking at ways to kind of goose you as you went through record.
And the music videos. What are the highlights of the videos?
Well, they're extraordinary. I mean, Ghost Town being the embryfication of what that song was about, which was urban misery and economic decline. He captures it so well. I mean, I've shown it to people who work in the built environment, and they're just amazed at how beautifully he captures that kind of urban desolation with just one camera. You know, they're all low budget shoots. There's a great one for Fun Boy 3, Lunatics Have Taken Over the Asylum, which is influenced by Kenneth Anger, which uses those kind of color washes. It's kind of homoerotic. There's several of them. There's of the 12 or 15 he made, there's not a bad one.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, he did so much stuff. I mean, he's, you know, his mind, it seems to me, he's one of those people whose mind's this kind of crazy cornucopia, like a magic place. You know, like many people who've got, you know, creative, busy minds, you sort of get the feeling that he was fending off the demons by, you know, this relentless work and relentless producing stuff. But he lives on. I mean, you know, as I said earlier, you've been a champion of him. You've kept him in the spotlight to an extent. You've kept his sort of legacy alive and making sure that people know about him, right?
What's great about that, actually, Stephen, is that it's kind of taken on a life of its own now. And the people I loved most turning on to Barney Bubbles, young Americans, young American designers or design students, because they don't come at the music like we do. I think it's probably going now. They don't care whether it's Hawkwind or Ian Jury or Psychedelic Furs, or, you know, they're not aligned with it. They see the design for what it is. And so, as I say, there are now lots of blogs written about him, and, you know, occasionally they'll cite me, and that's great. But, you know, they've kind of taken him on board as part of the canon, which is really the point of the job.
Great. So people can find out more about Barney Bubbles from your book, Reasons to be Cheerful, coming out in a new edition soon. And what about you? Where can they find out more about Paul Gorman?
PaulGormanis.com is my blog, which I haven't updated very much, but you can find me on Instagram. I put a lot of stuff up there. The next edition of Reasons to be Cheerful, the Barney Bubbles book, will be out next year. and I'm putting together with the publisher, this is a major publisher I've worked with before, a box of goodies. So we're going to be reproducing some of those geodesic domes that you can build yourself or silver pyramids. So we're looking forward to that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Put me down for one of those. So, Paul, thank you. That was a wonderful whirlwind trip through the mind and life and magic light of Barney Bubbles. I should also mention that your recent biography of Malcolm McLaren has been getting rave reviews. So that's it. I think we should get you back to talk about some more countercultural stuff.
Love to. Anytime, Steve.
Thanks, Paul.
All right, man.
So there we have it. The wonderful world of Barney Bubbles with Mr. Paul Gorman. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed all these Bureau of Lost Culture programs. You can check us out more at bureauoflostculture.com. You can check out Paul, as he said. I put his links in the show notes. And see you soon, hear you soon, for more Tales from the Underground. Bye-bye.